we'd really appreciate you guys. The chat's there. As we go through this, put your thoughts, please, into the chat. We really want to understand. This is the reference model that's owned by you guys, and we want to understand how you feel and where we're going to go from here. So, just a few key messages from myself, from the steering committee. We are a model that's been made, if you remember, and I'll talk a little about the history, but we've been made by the industry for the industry. And it's us that owns the model. There isn't anybody else that owns the model. In fact, we used to be under the DIA umbrella, and we're now very much an independent entity. The reference model is freely available. There's a website. Everybody gives their time freely. Nobody gets paid for anything. I think we pay a tiny bit for something to do with the website, and that's about it. And we've been going for 11 years now, coming up to 11 years, and we need to think about the future. We want to make sure that this model carries us through the next 11 years and the 11 years after that. We also want to be very transparent with you as a team, as a group. We want to make sure that everybody understands what we've been thinking, and we want the members to guide where we go. So we're going to be doing things like surveys, etc., but it's very much what's the next step for the reference model. And a lot of us feel that it's like our baby. We've all grown up with it, and we're very fond of it. It comes out in every time who's on the steering committee especially, but everybody who goes into meetings and things, there's almost like bingo to see if you can say a reference model. So just as a reminder as to how we got here, just for those of you who might be new, or those of you who can't remember, but for those of you who've seen the slide 50 times, sorry. But we started in March 2009, and we started off as a bit of a passionate exploration, I think is the only way of talking it. And we started pulling things together, and suddenly we came up with this model, and then we talked to the regulators, and suddenly it became a little bit more serious, but it was still not managed as a formal thing. It was much more just a little bit haphazard, which is why we then got the steering, besides all the other releases, we had the steering committee established in 2014. We have a charter established. We have a steering committee charter. So we are definitely putting some controls, we put some controls around it. And there's a lot of passion and focus that goes into it. But we then released the exchange mechanism in 2018, which is something which Paul has obviously been leading with others, the exchange mechanism, and this is around standardization. And I think it's things like that, and the requests to have all the different types of studies, etc., that's really made us think. So we know as a steering committee that we need to show that we are sustainable, we can keep going for the next 20 years. We also need to stay current, and the world is definitely changing. The TMF world is definitely changing, documents, data, etc., etc. So I'm going to hand over to Paul to talk a little bit about what we've been discussing and what it all means. And guys, please, I really would love some comments from people, even if you just say that's interesting, even if if you disagree with anything we say. Please, if you want to be controversial, feel free. Because this is your reference model. And there's 138 of you on here who own it. So feel free. Anyway, over to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So as you saw from the slides that David presented, there was kind of a big long list of things that people wanted to see in the reference model. And so we as a steering committee, when we got those results back, put our thinking caps on and started to kind of think, well, how can we do these things? How can we sort of take these things forward? And what should we prioritize? What's going to sort of give the most value back to the community? And as we were doing that, we were sort of realizing that it's quite challenging because of the granularity and the complexity of the TMF. The TMF is quite a complex beast. And the more things we start to try and define and map means that it becomes quite unwieldy to manage all of that in an Excel spreadsheet. We've been using an Excel spreadsheet for the last 11 years, and it's served us well, but we're kind of getting to the limit of that. And especially when we start to think about, mapping to other models or having a much more comprehensive set of metadata, or even things like relationships between artifacts, all of a sudden the complexity becomes exponential. And so, one thing that we were sort of exploring was, well, how could we sort of move maybe to something which is a little bit more technologically advanced to manage? And I'll speak to that in a moment. The other thing that we were thinking about is obviously the exchange mechanism and the fact that the exchange mechanism aims to be a standard to allow the easy exchange of content and TMF information between organizations and systems. We spent a good 2 years, if not more, defining this standard, which we had high hopes for. We thought that the industry would jump on it because obviously, as we saw in the survey, the transfer of content, especially at the end of the study, is still a challenge. And also in the future, as we start to go more and more towards data rather than documents, and having many more systems, it's also going to be really important that we have ways and means of exchanging information between organizations. And so what we want to sort of understand, and that's why we recently did a survey, was, well, what's blocking the industry from adopting the exchange mechanism? And I think we've got some ideas, but we really need to start to think about standardization, and not just of the exchange mechanism, but maybe also of the whole reference model itself. The other thing that for us is important is obviously having a voice with the regulators and having involvement in some of the initiatives that are sort of underway. And I'm thinking especially about ICH E6R3 and those kinds of things where there's focus being put on what kind of essential documents which should we have, what kind of content should we have in a TMF, and then also what should be defined in the regulations. And that's, I think, a really big question, and I think it's really important that we do have a voice as a community, because I think we definitely are a very large community, and I think that we have very strong opinions as to what we think we should be seeing in the regulations. And then finally, the other thing that we've been talking about is governance and funding, and how we can ensure the long-term longevity or perennity of the model. And also find ways of funding initiatives, because as we see that we're adding more and more into the model, or people are asking us, the community is asking us to add more and more into the model, we need to start to be able to use more sophisticated tools, for example. And the problem is that these things cost money. And right now, as Karen said, we're purely voluntary. There's no membership fees or anything like that within the reference model, and that's fine to a certain extent, but if we want to go further, well, sometimes we may need to be able to fund things, and so that's something that we've also been thinking about. Karen, next slide. So as a steering committee, we've taken it upon ourselves to start to think about this in more detail, and also, more importantly, to get community feedback from you guys. It's important that you have your say, because ultimately the model belongs to you. And so we're going to be thinking about, well, what are the different things that we could do to ensure the perennity and evolve the model and meet the industry requirements, and also adapt to the future. And so we have sort of various different options, I think, available to us. The first thing is that we could actually just do nothing and carry on as we are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think it's fine to do that, but we just need to realize that there may be some limitations in terms of how many different initiatives we can take on. We could also try and find ways of funding new initiatives and tools, as well as formalizing the TMF Reference Model organization. As you know, today, there is no formal entity. We're not a non-for-profit organization. We don't really have a legal entity. And that has certain challenges, notably in terms of funding, but even for things like standardization. And so we're thinking very carefully about that. And that's not necessarily a simple thing to do, right, to put that kind of thing in place. But we are thinking about it. We're also thinking about other standards organizations that exist out there in the industry that we could maybe partner with or associate with, because they quite often are funded. They do have an entity and they've got resources, they've got tools, that we could potentially use. And so that's something that we're also thinking very carefully about. Are there bodies out there that could be a good fit for us to associate with? And then we don't have all of the answers, right? We've only really just started to think about this. So there could be other things that we can do to future-proof the reference model. And we really want to hear from you as a community to have your thoughts and see if you have ideas about things that we could do to be able to move this thing forward. And so one of the things that we're going to start to put together in the next few months is a survey directly on this subject, which we'll send out to you guys so that you can provide us with feedback. And for us, transparency is extremely important. Any things that we're doing, of course, we want you to be aware of, and that's why we're talking about this today. And we very much value your thoughts and ideas on how do we take all of the good work that we've done as a community and ensure that we can safeguard that, but also that we can evolve it and properly manage and maintain it. So I'm going to pass things back to Karen. I can see there's a whole bunch of comments, and Karen, maybe you want to take the comments. Karen, we can't hear you.
Hold on. Yes, it's a bit of a joint effort. Sorry, your dog was barking and mine started.
Okay.
So I'm going to pick up some of the comments, but I'm going to throw some questions back to you as well, Paul, because I think some of the comments are really interesting. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people thinking that some of these things would be very, very useful. For example, Adam was saying about linking to a unified ISF reference model, and this all ties back to how do you get things to talk to each other. There was one question from Jennifer about other platforms being considered rather than Excel. Todd, thank you very much for putting an answer down, saying obviously that we're not actually looking at a specific platform. But Paul, I wondered if you wanted to just give a little bit of insight into your sort of database thoughts, just to give a bit why, and also the fact that we all appreciate that Excel is an excellent tool and that we're not going to dump Excel. It's more about, do you want to just explain that concept?
Yeah, sure. So Kathy Clark, who's also a steering committee member, and myself took it upon ourselves to look into alternate ways of storing and presenting information for the reference model. And this came about because we were sort of undergoing several mapping exercises, notably around real world trials, but also around ISF. And we were realizing that we can't just keep adding columns to the spreadsheet. After a while, it's just going to become too unwieldy. And so we started to look into how we could structure a database, and we did an exercise in Microsoft Access, which obviously is quite old now, but it's pretty easy, pretty user friendly, and we started to sort of work out, okay, well, how can we take that spreadsheet and then make it multi-dimensional so that we can have relationships between the different data points. So for example, if I have a sub artifact that could be used in multiple artifacts, well, with a database, you can have things that are multi-dimensional, and you'd be able to say, well, show me all of the artifacts that this sub-artifact relates to. Or, you could also have like filtering. So show me all of the artifacts that are also present in an ISF. So these kinds of things we were thinking about. And then we also wanted to be able to do outputs. So we wanted to be able to do sort of on-screen outputs, but also do Excel spreadsheet outputs, because obviously people kind of like to work with Excel. And the idea would be that if we had a central database, we could then export to Excel a subset of what we've kind of filtered within that database. The other thing that we were thinking about is change control. So, we have a change control board within the reference model, and change control, requires proper impact assessment, and it also requires, sort of standardization and harmonization. And so we're also thinking that this database tool could also be a useful tool for the change control board, for them to be able to do proper impact assessment when people request changes to artifacts or zones or metadata or any of the things that exist in the reference model. And especially if we start to implement other initiatives like a more broad set of metadata, or defining relationships between artifacts and clustering and all of those kinds of things, the change control board are going to have some kind of tool to make it easier for them to be able to do that impact assessment. Now, we did do a sort of an initial prototype, but we stopped because we realized that MS Access isn't really going to cut it. We do need to have maybe something a little bit more sophisticated, and also we're not database designers or database administrators or even software developers or software integrators, and so we also had a limit in terms of our knowledge to be able to do this kind of thing. And ideally, if you were going to undertake something like that, you'd probably work with a third party or a vendor who's specialized in that. And that kind of triggered some of the discussions that we had about the fact that we want to do these things and we need a better platform, but at the same time, we don't really have any resources. We don't have any sort of financial resources or any human resources to be able to do these things. And that's kind of what spurred some of the discussion around future-proofing as well. Does that make sense, Karen?
Yeah, no, absolutely perfect description. I think interesting, Michael, Hermes, you mentioned about working with the naming conventions and having them dynamically linked to the reference model. And to support something like that, you really need more than an Excel spreadsheet, because otherwise, how on earth would you actually capture all that information? But also to the point that you raised in terms of sort of funding, and I know, Rosemary, you mentioned something about getting the end users and have societies waiving fees, and that will help. I do apologize. That will help for in terms of getting the message out. I think the challenge that we've got is how do we actually get the money in. I think I'm going to quote Fran Ross and say, anyone got $1 million for us, because then that might actually help us able to get but probably nobody, if they've got $1 million, wants to necessarily spend it on the reference model. So we are definitely at a crossroads in terms of what do we do. And as Paul said, we've got 4 different options in front of us. I'm sure there's others. We're going to be asking all of you the opinion. Jo Marie Johnson, I think you made a comment about getting FDA input and being very helpful. And one of the things that we struggle with is having people listen to us, because, ICAG 6R3, we want to get there, but we're sort of pulled in sort of round the corner under the curtains by one of our members who happens to be in a big pharma company that's at the table. And we're not at the table because we are not recognized. So somehow we need to think about things like that as well. So hopefully that's given you guys a bit of an idea as to what we're thinking, where we are. If anyone has any thoughts or wants to even contribute ideas, this is your reference model. Just, you can put in the chat, or ping me, kroy@flexglobal.com, and we can have a chat, so we can take it forward from here. It's exciting times.
Can I just add something, Karen? Also,
yeah,
I think
of course.
one thing that's really important to us is that we still maintain this model, by the industry for the industry. And so whatever's done, the goal is not to start to, like charge people to use it or anything like that. I think, we definitely want to have free distribution. We just need to find ways of being able to take it forward. I think that's important to underline, just in case anyone's worried.
Agree.
All right.
Anybody else got any? Well, anyway, feel free, obviously, to add comments as we go. If anybody's got any other thoughts, then that's great. And if anybody wants to, as I said, if anybody wants to get involved, then or speak up. Is there anybody who wants to say anything? I don't know whether Fran or Lisa or so anybody else from the steering committee or anybody wants to add anything.
Hey, I was just adding it into the chat. Thank you, Karen. This is Lisa, everyone. And Paul, thank you for adding that bit in, because, as we started this initiative, it was so that the TMF reference model was accessible and available to everyone, so that we could, and all companies in our industry, so that we could, further our document management and, practices and policies for TMF, so that we were maintaining it and calling it and managing it the same. So as we are looking at this, as Paul said, know that we are making sure that we are staying true where we can, as much as we can, or all that we can, to that founding principle. Okay, everyone. So don't immediately worry that we don't have everybody's back, because it would become something that would be paid for. That's what that would be brought back to all of our constituents to know if where we are, if that would ever happen. But we just want to stay true to that founding principle.
Absolutely, and I think I totally agree with you, Lisa, and that's why one of the key messages, it's freely available, and it should stay and will stay so. As in, it needs to be available for everybody to everybody. So, and thank you, Todd, for your comments. Anybody else want to make anything before we move on? Fantastic. Okay.